This week, Lauren Tarshis, author of I Survived the Attacks of September 11th, 2001, and other I Survived books for young readers, talks about her process.
So I find the whole thing super challenging. What is your process? And I'm like, if you have a process to recommend that could make this less chaotic and torturous, could you please tell me?
Welcome to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline. I'm your host, Monica Hadley, and with me is my mother and co-host, Caroline Kilborn.
And hello, everyone. I hope you're having a good day today.
And how's your day, Mom?
Oh, it's okay. It's a nice day.
It is a nice day. That is true. That is true. It's a beautiful, beautiful early autumn, late summer.
Yes.
Kind of perfect. Yeah. So it is also September, and we're coming up as we're recording this on September 11th, the 20th anniversary of the date that all of us will remember for all of our lives, which is 9/11, 9/11/01. And our guest today is Lauren Tarshis, and she is the author of the best-selling I Survived series, which has over 34 million copies in print, which tells the stories of young people and their resilience and strength in the midst of unimaginable disasters and times of turmoil. Lauren has brought her signature warmth and exhaustive research to topics such as the Battle of D-Day, the American Revolution, Hurricane Katrina, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and now 9/11. So the book that we're looking at today is the graphic version of I Survived the Attacks of September 11th, 2001. Welcome to Writers' Voices, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Monica. Hi, Carolyn.
So how did this series get its start?
Well, I started writing the series more than 10 years ago, and I would say that it was shaped by a couple of different forces. One, I have spent almost my entire career at Scholastic in the magazine division, which was actually the founding division of Scholastic 101 years ago. The company was founded with a single magazine for high school students designed to help kids understand facts and a bit about history, to help them become clear thinkers, to be participants in our democracy. So around that, a single magazine, this big division grew. We now have 25 different resources from pre-K all the way up to high school. So I've kind of grown up in this division where the whole mission is to take big, important stories and engage kids in science and social studies to build their knowledge. These are resources used in classrooms. So I've spent a lot of my time with teachers and kids in classrooms. So I noticed that kids were always fascinated by history if there was a child at the center of the story. Even topics that seemed, quote, boring or irrelevant to them, if I wrote a story that was a narrative nonfiction story, those are the stories that I would get the most enthusiastic, excited, sometimes ecstatic response to. At the same time, I have 4 children, and I was not a reader growing up, and I was just noted that I really did have trouble finding exciting, meaningful stories for my kids to read. They just weren't the type of kids who were like under the covers with a flashlight reading Lord of the Rings when they were 9 years old. The struggle. So I took both those hats, my mother hat and my editor hat, my writer hat. I saw this little niche on the bookshelves between Magic Treehouse, Mary Pope Osborne's great series, and like maybe The Lightning Thief, or one of these some of these exciting series for older kids. So that's the long story about how it started, Monica, and it's just kind of continued. I'm starting my 22nd book in the core series. We have 4 graphic novels out now. The September 11th adaptation of one of my novels just came out in time for the 20th anniversary. And the idea is to make these topics accessible in an age-appropriate way. I do an enormous amount of research and visit all the places I write about, interview experts, read dozens of books, study primary source documents, and work very closely with educators as well. So the graphic novels have just been a really wonderful extension of that work to bring these stories in a new format and make them accessible even more readers, hopefully.
So, Lauren, what was the first subject that you wrote about for I Survived?
Well, I thought when I first had the idea for the series that I was going to write only about sort of long ago, mostly natural disasters, but the Titanic was the first one that was actually Scholastic said, well, we like all your ideas, but you should really write about the Titanic version. I said, well, would I do that? There's like 100 books out on the Titanic for kids. And I still remember this woman because, I work in New York. She had a very thick Bronx accent. She goes, yes, because everyone loves the Titanic. That was true. So that kicked it off. And then, but very quickly, I started to hear from my readers about what they were interested in. And they wanted topics, not just natural disasters, but they wanted Revolutionary War, World War II. And September 11th was by far the most requested topic, which shocked me because these kids were not born yet when September 11th happened. Many of them didn't really know what to call it. They dimly had heard of something happening. Obviously, this every year the date comes and I think the emotion of it, the solemnity of it. Many kids were curious, and I heard from many teachers and librarians that at the time, there really weren't. I wrote that book, I think, maybe 6-7 years ago. There are more books out now to help teachers and parents, share this day with their kids and help them understand it. But I still remember a teacher said, I need a safe way of introducing this topic to my kids who are deeply curious. And I don't want them stumbling online and seeing, such a complicated event. There's so many aspects that are really overwhelming. So that was my objective.
That makes a lot of sense. In every generation, seems like there's some major event like this that changes the world, changes lives. And of course, the kids who were born since then need to know about that. This is part of why the world is the way it is right now. When COVID was starting, when we were just right before we went into lockdown, I saw my grandkids, and I didn't see them for quite a while after that, but who were, they're 8 and 11 now, so I guess they were 7 and 10 then. And I was talking to them about how COVID was going to be sort of the crucial or really long-lasting event of their generation. And I said, and they were scared about it. And I said, but there's been all these different events over the years. And so I was trying to kind of give them an idea of, yes, these other things happened that were horrible and we've recovered from them. And I brought up 9/11 as, the generation before them. And the younger one had not heard of it. The older one was sort of familiar. And I showed them the video of the towers falling on my phone. And then I thought, well, should I have done that or should I have not done that? Was that terrifying? But they actually, here we were almost 20 years later, and it's like, obviously we survived. So yeah. I think the fact that you're doing this as I Survived is really important.
It's, I think what you said really resonates with me about, these defining episodes of a generation. And one of the things that I did a lot of during COVID, I was in a lot of classes. I was like Zooming almost every day with kids and teachers, just anyone who asked, I was like, yes, 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 yes. Ended up sharing, I remembered the stories my grandmother, to whom I was super close, who passed away about 7 years ago. She would tell me stories about polio. Growing up during these polio outbreaks, and her little cousin Dolly, who got polio and was the flower girl at my grandmother's wedding and had braces on and crutches, under her dress, and how, and she told me she used to tell me these stories when I was growing up, and I remembered them. They came back to me during COVID because I thought, to your point, well, it was very similar. I mean, the feeling of terror. And of course that struck, the children, the fact that many of the victims were children and they ended up with these, life-changing injuries. I think it was similar. And then look what happened. They found a vaccine. The disease is really unknown in America today. And I would always, and so I created some articles about this, and I would say to kids in the beginning of my presentation, I'd talk about it, I go, how many of you have heard of polio? No one.
No one. Wow.
And I said, isn't that something? So who knows? Well, 50 years from now, when you talk to your grandchildren, you might be telling them about something that you'll have these incredible stories and they'll be fascinated by them. But hopefully it's very possible that it won't be a fact of life. And it could even be one of these events like this great influenza. So many episodes in your neck of the woods, the locust plagues that hit, in the late 1800s, where swarms, millions of grasshoppers would come and devour all the crops. For people living through it, it was like that was their whole existence. They lived in fear. But how many people even talk about that today?
Yeah, it was like the end of the world.
Yeah.
And yet it wasn't.
That's right.
Yeah. Mom, do you remember the polio scare? And how old would you have been?
See, that was the worst thing that could happen to you if you were a kid, that you would get polio.
Yeah.
And then, Jonas Salk found a vaccine. And so, that's why I knew in my heart that God would give somebody the talent to find a vaccine for COVID.
Yeah.
Because that's the way the world works. So, yeah.
So, Mom, how old were you? How old were you when the polio vaccine came out?
Well, let's see. I was babysitting some kids whose mother worked at the hospital in Newton one summer, and they were bringing some kids in. So I was a teenager. I might have been first. I remember your father and me went and got the vaccine. So it was probably in the 50s when it came out.
Okay, so you would have been in your early 20s when it came out. So you lived your entire childhood with that threat hanging over.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Wow.
And I had rheumatic fever. So my mother thought maybe I had polio. So I couldn't move my legs, and she called the doctor, and he said, well, can she touch her? And she touched her chest with her chin. And my mother said, I don't know, just a minute. She asked me, and I didn't. And so then she said, no, she doesn't have polio. So that was one of the things, I guess.
Wow.
That's amazing. Yeah.
And tuberculosis also was a threat when you were a child, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, sure. There's been a lot of things that they have found cures for, or that they have found treatments for, that they didn't have any idea what to do back in the day. Just like today, I think every 5 years they come out with new things. Just like they can cure some cancers now that they couldn't 5 years ago. So. Right.
Yeah.
You're listening to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline, and our guest today is Lauren Tarshis, author of I Survived the Attacks of September 11th, 2001. So when you sit down to write like this book, how do you decide who the lead character is going to be and what the story, because it's a story of a historical event, but it's also a story of one child.
Right.
So.
Yeah. I mean, I realize my books are historical fiction, and they're really, I in many cases, the story of the child himself or herself, my fictional main character, and the problem that they have that's separate from the event. I create an entire world of these characters and a predicament that they're often dealing with even before the flood comes or before, the event. They could almost be its own middle grade novel. So then I nestle this middle grade novel with characters and problems that my kids can relate to. My readers will relate to. Lucas is the main character of 9/11. He's a football maniac who is dealing with the possibility of having to lose football because he got concussions, which I know is something that a lot of kids deal with. My own sons did. His father is a New York City firefighter who, and so he's grown up in this incredible culture of pride and sacrifice, and that's palpable. His best, mentor is his Uncle Benny, his dad's best friend, who's a firefighter who was there for the family when Lucas's father was injured a few years back. So I think, Monica, that it's definitely the most challenging part of writing these books is each one is not just this huge research journey and then conveying the information and facts to my readers, but weaving a story with a relatable character who my kids will connect to, and then unspooling the story through the experience of this fictional character. So I find the whole thing super challenging. Yes. Someone always is like, what is your process? And I'm like, if you have a process to recommend that could be less chaotic and torturous, could you please tell me? I just do not. I have friends who are writers that's like, oh, these are my index cards and here's my PowerPoint and I did this and I do this. And I'm thinking, what is wrong with me? I mean, I'm just starting the 22nd book now, and I can just tell it's going to be millions of drafts, late nights, halfway through and starting again. And you'd think, the only consolation is I figure, oh, well, I've done it before.
I can do it again.
I'll do it again. So, but it's a very gratifying experience because I have such a great connection to my readers and teachers and librarians, and get a lot of grandparents who write to me and they share these stories with their grandkids. So especially now during COVID, this time of disconnection, being able to connect with you and your mom, it's just been, for me, a wonderful opportunity to forge relationships with all kinds of people around the country.
Wow. Have you ever started writing on a topic and then just like, nope, I just can't do this one?
9/11 seemed to be that. And I think, I got so many requests for that from kids that I felt like, I did an almost full draft and I started all over again. Wasn't, to be honest with you, the series now, I do one a year now. I used to do 2 a year. And the pulsating pace of this means that, the covers get done while I'm writing them. And they're already kind of being sold, while I'm writing them, and so I can't back away. That's the problem. It's too late. So I guess it's a mercy because maybe there are a couple of topics, not so much. I did the Holocaust again. Tons of kids requested this. I decided to do a sort of little lesser known aspect of that event, which is the Jewish partisans, bands of Jewish fighters who escaped from the ghettos and formed fighting resistance bands and fought in the woods of Eastern Europe. And it's an incredible, incredible chapter that is undertold, that isn't taking place in the concentration camps in the traditional, these things. And it has a very, it was grueling, but it had, I was able to really focus on this, the resistance to the Nazis. But even that, I thought, once, I get knee deep into the research and I think how am I going to possibly make this appropriate for my young readers? Because I don't want to introduce ideas especially about human evil, that are just, it's like how you felt about showing that picture to your grandkids. Like,
yeah.
It's too much. So, I'm mindful of that, but surprisingly so far, many parents are my readers. They generally, if they're with a parent, they're at a book fair with their teachers. And my audience tends to be fairly self-selecting, and these really are very often family reads. So parents my own daughter, my youngest, she was not an I Survive reader. This is a person terrified of even, she just didn't even like The Wizard of Oz. The monkeys were too much for her. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important that parents know, some children don't need, my daughter wanted to preserve. She didn't want to know anything going on in the world outside of her little bubble with her Polly Pockets. And that was great, But other kids are really, really, I just cannot believe the kind of kinds of questions I get from very young readers. And very often they're not the kids who, as I said, who are the avid readers or the most studious kids. They're kids who are just fascinated and they've become engaged. And sometimes they're kids who have just come to this country and don't speak English as well, or they're kids who are fragile in other ways who connect to my characters. And I really am at times I'm awed by the intensity of their curiosity, the insightfulness of their questions, the connections they make between historical events to their own lives, the questions they ask their parents. They want to go on field trips to Gettysburg and Mount St. Helens. And so
those are some of the other topics you've written about.
Yes.
The eruption of Mount St. Helens.
Mount St. Helens. That was a suggestion from an I Survived reader. So I kind of alternate between big, huge events like the Battle of Gettysburg or the Revolutionary War or D-Day. Iconic storms. My latest book is the Galveston Hurricane of 1900, which is to this day the deadliest natural disaster in American history. That just came out this week. So that event changed the course of Texas history, because Galveston was supposed to overtake Houston as the most, the third big city in Texas, and its port was the most important in all of the South after New Orleans, but it never recovered after that storm. That storm also, of course, changed our ideas about weather science and how to fortify ourselves against powerful storms. So I think, I've done all of these different topics, some very little known, like the Great Molasses Flood of 1919, a 3 million gallon tank the size of a building was built in a crowded immigrant neighborhood in Boston, filled with molasses that was used to build bombs for World War I. I'm not making this up. And of course, the builders didn't care about the safety of the tank. It was groaning and leaking. And one day it just erupted and sent a tsunami of molasses through the north end of Boston, killing dozens of people, destroying a swath of the neighborhood. So you'd think, in some ways, an event like that is written about as like, oh, sticky disaster, almost, like this footnote that's but actually it was not only tragic, it changed our history, because up till that point, you could build anything you wanted. You didn't have to have an architect. Someone could go to your neighborhood if they owned the land and just build whatever they wanted. There were no building zoning laws and codes. But after that, the laws changed. So it's interesting to see how these events shape the world that we're living in today. How the Chicago Fire of 1871, we celebrate Fire Prevention Month in October because of the Chicago Fire. The lessons that we learned about urban fires from the Chicago Fire has probably saved thousands and thousands of lives, because buildings are built differently. Firefighters have different tools. So I don't know. As you can tell, Monica, I could go on and on.
The one thing I really liked about this, and you said that you always tried to use it from a child's standpoint, I thought that was really fantastic, and the fact that it wasn't just the people in the tower, it was the people all around. And, I never thought about that. The people all around there in New York City.
Yeah.
That were impacted that day by the actual happening, and because of the smoke and everything, and they were just terrified and so forth. And it was, I really did that. Everybody says, "Where were you on 9/11?" I think everybody can remember that. And I had an interesting experience, if I may tell you. I was having a mammogram, and they had TV there in the waiting room, and I saw the second tower.
Oh my gosh.
And so when I went out then was through, I went out and I told the gals at the desk about it, and of course they couldn't believe that it had happened. And I said, well, you just turn on the TV and you'll see. And then I went to my daughter's in Brighton, which is about a half hour from where I live, and flying over her house was Air Force One and a fighter plane on each side of it, and they were headed for Omaha.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Which is
oh my gosh. Yeah, it's just everyone, you're so right what you said, there are certain events that we just, all those details are just now ingrained in your mind forever, right? And those are the stories you'll pass down. I was born the day after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. He was killed on November 22nd, 1963, and I was born the day after. And the stories that my mother has shared about being in a Catholic hospital in New Mexico and the nurses crying, but no one would tell her what was happening. And I grew up much like kids who were born, around 9/11, just so fascinated by that. I knew that the world had changed, right?
Yeah.
And I just its grip on me has never really let go.
I was just thinking about that because, of course, that's another event that people say, where were you?
Yes.
When this happened. But that would be a tough one to do as I survived, wouldn't it? Because how could you center a child in that story?
Well, I think you're exactly right. And I think that is the one limiting factor to my topics. I get so many, as I said, I get so many suggestions from kids that are wonderful. Things like Apollo 13. There's certain events that you can't slip a child onto a NASA spacecraft, right?
Right.
And some of them, are just, you can't credibly put a child. It was 9/11 was difficult because fortunately, there weren't children in the towers. And, so, luckily, there was, there weren't any kids, because of, this being a business district.
Right.
But I was, it was really challenging to figure out how to center Lucas in a meaningful, purposeful way, as opposed to him just like walking by the towers that day. Right. So it was not until I figured out that by placing him in a family of firefighters, that that it would give the story another dimension that was also relevant, of course, to 9/11, because so many of the people who lost their lives were first responders, and so many of the firefighters who were there that way were irreparably, changed by what they witnessed and the losses they suffered, and many of them have lingering health effects even today.
Right.
So when one of your books gets converted to a graphic novel, how does that process work?
Ooh, that's exciting. It's particularly exciting because I am really a delighted bystander, just watching this beautiful process take place. And Scholastic has found this wonderful woman named Georgia Ball, who is a graphic novel script writer. So she takes my stories and she converts them to a script, which includes, the text. She extracts text from my stories, and then she gives direction to the artist. So she imagines them almost like, written out storyboards, and then they get turned over to an artist or sometimes a team of artists. It's been different artists for each of the 4 books out so far, and each one is they're continuing to do them. We're working on the Attack of the Grizzlies, which is about an event that happened in Glacier National Park in 1967, and Hurricane Katrina is also we're working on that as well, and Chicago Fire is just beginning. So just watching these, they take more than a year. There's an enormous amount of extra work that goes in because, of course, they have to now, I'm meticulous about my research and my facts, but the artists are bringing to life additional things that maybe I'm not describing in detail. So like for 9/11, we had to find out what were the model of police cars that were on the streets of New York in 2001. Everything, what kind of T-shirt does an off-duty firefighter wear in 2001? All of these little details we have to do additional research to tell the story in such a visual format.
And you do that, or do you have help with that?
George does a lot. My editor does a lot. I help a lot. But I am really in the hands of this incredible team, and it's a joy to have people who care as much about my characters as I do. The 9/11 book is beautiful. You should see the Titanic and the Nazi invasion and the shark attack. They're equally they're glorious. They're like works of art. So it's just been this whole other dimension of my creative journey, is seeing, and being able to entrust my stories and my characters that I work so hard on in the hands of these creative people.
Well, let's go back to the research that you do. So,
sure.
Yeah. So are you doing, like, is it mostly on the internet? What's your sort of, how do you delve into it?
I have gone to every place that I've written about in the 21 books, with the exception of 2. I did not go to the bottom of the North Atlantic to explore the wreckage of the Titanic. So I would need a submarine and, I don't know, maybe a couple $1 million. And then I did not get to go to Japan. I did write about the tsunami that happened there, but I did not I did not have the opportunity to make that trip. Everywhere else, whether it's New Orleans for Katrina, Mount St. Helens to peer into the crater, Vesuvius, Pompeii, Pearl Harbor, Gettysburg, battlefields for the American Revolution, Normandy to write about D-Day. I mean, obviously this is wonderful, fun, but it's serious. They're very hard work, those trips. I go there, I plan them, months in advance, and there's always, I make contact with experts, or often people whose stories are integral to my research. So even if it's Chicago fire, I'm going to the Chicago History Museum to pore over letters and memoirs. In Normandy, the guide found 2 people who were children during the D-Day invasion and hid in the cornfields, and they invited me to their home. This woman who was in her 90s, unbelievable. So that piece of it is kind of magical, because I always do research before I go on the trip. So I've really prepared myself. And what I'm trying to do on the research trip is also really imagine myself walking in the footsteps of my characters as they're coming to life. So there's just an endless amount of reading, going to museums, talking to scientists and historians. I'm always looking out for those little details that are just going to hopefully really grab hold of a child's fascination, their imagination, and try to bring the story to life, as Caroline says, through the, really, I really want the kids to almost feel transported.
Yeah. Well, I think you really succeeded with this book, and I'm looking forward to trying to read some of the others, because I really did enjoy this, and the way that you presented this, and the experience of this young boy. And,
thank you so much.
Now they only sent us the graphic novel, and I'm curious as to how, what percentage of the text from your book makes it into the graphic novel?
It's an interesting question, because it's not that much, but somehow it's Georgia, between the visuals and the text, the heart and spirit and is translated. It's pretty incredible. I mean, I have to admit that I was very skeptical, and I agreed when they asked if I would, agree to have them adapted. I was very nervous. And I agreed to just try with the Titanic and decide, how it went. Because to your point, I just didn't know, I couldn't really imagine what these were going to turn into. What did strike me most was how much of the story, the whole story's there. And it's a small amount of text, because these are visual experiences, but yet somehow the heart of the story translates. It's just quite something.
So how many, what would be the word count of your typical novel?
My word count, they've crept up. I'm one of my questions was, why are these so much harder to write these days? Well, one answer is they're a lot longer. My first books were maybe 11,000, and now they're up to 14 or 15,000. Plus, I've really expanded. That's just the story part. The back matter, the books are much thicker now, because the back part of the book, I always did write a letter to the kids after I finished writing. One of the things I do is I have so much more I want to share, and I really want to connect with my reader through this sort of expanded letter essay that I write when I finish writing the book to them, to let them know what the book meant to me, what the personal experience was, if I have a connection to the story, what I really took away from it, and what are special things I want them to know. And then I always had sort of these question and answers, like about the Titanic, the facts, and other shipwrecks, and that kind of thing. Well, that section they have grown exponentially, because I really want the books to deliver a big wallop of knowledge. So if I know, hopefully by the end of the book, by the end of reading about the Galveston hurricane, I hope that they're engaged. And here's my chance to really give them a big dose of storm science, help them understand the science of hurricanes, some history of Texas, all of that. So the books themselves have just expanded over the years.
Well, Lauren, maybe you can read a little bit from that back section of I Survived the Attacks of September 11th.
So as I said, I always write a letter at the end of these books, and the 9/11 letter was very personal because of the experience that I had on 9/11, which I was not, my office is actually very close to Ground Zero, our Scholastic offices. I was not there. I had taken a week off because there was a reunion of my husband's family. They had done, in Germany, and I was traveling alone back from that and got trapped. So let me, okay, here it is. Should I read it, Monica?
Sure.
Okay. It was not a part of my original plan to write about September 11th, 2001 in the I Survived series, but over the past 2 years, I've received more than 1,000 emails from kids asking me to write about this topic. At school visits, there are always kids raising their hands and asking, will you be writing about 9/11? At first, my answer was always no. I was shocked that you would be so curious about that terrible day that I had been trying to forget since it happened. I have friends who lost family members on 9/11 and others who narrowly escaped the towers before they collapsed. The memories of that day remain sharp and terrifying. Though I work in New York City in an office about a mile from the World Trade Center, I was not in New York City when the plane struck. I was on a plane above the Atlantic Ocean heading back to New York from a family reunion celebration in Europe. I had said goodbye to my husband in London. He was staying for a wedding of a business friend. I couldn't wait to see my kids and my parents, who would be waiting for me at a Little League game in our town about 35 miles from New York City. An hour and a half into the flight, I suddenly had the feeling that the plane was making a slow turn. Nobody else seemed to notice. I sat nervously, hoping I was imagining it. But then a stewardess made an announcement. Quote, there has been a catastrophic event affecting all of North American airspace, she said. We are returning to London. We will provide more information shortly. Catastrophic event? The plane was silent as people tried to grasp what this could possibly mean. Earthquake? Bomb? One man actually thought a meteor could have hit somewhere in America. And then moments later, the stewardess made another announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, I will now tell you what has occurred, and for reasons I will never understand, she told our plane load of terrified people exactly what was happening. The plane had been hijacked by terrorists and flown into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. There could be other planes involved, she said. The disaster was still unfolding. An hour and a half later, we landed in London. Police escorted us into the chaotic airport. Somehow I tracked down my husband. It wasn't until late that night that we were finally able to get a call to our kids and my mom and dad. It was 4 days before flights started flying into the United States and we could get home. What a sad and frightening time it was. Thousands of firefighters and other rescue workers swarmed the 16-acre disaster zone, searching for survivors. The area, which became known as Ground Zero, was extremely dangerous. Underground fires smoldered, and the smoke was a toxic mix of melted plastic, steel, lead, and many poisonous chemicals. Few of the rescue workers had on proper protective clothing or masks. And as it quickly became clear, there were not very many survivors to find. Only 14 people were pulled out of the rubble alive, all within the first 24 hours of the collapse. About 50,000 people had been working in the buildings that day. 2,016 died. Also among the dead, 343 firefighters and 60 police officers who were in or near the building when they collapsed. In the months after the attacks, it was hard to imagine that life would ever go back to normal. It never will for many people, like my friend who lost her brother, like the hundreds of firefighters who have serious health problems caused by the toxic smoke and the dust they breathed at Ground Zero, like the thousands who managed to escape that day but who saw the horrors up close. Today, while the horrors of that day still linger, the city itself is more vibrant than ever. People have done their best to move forward. So why did I write this book? Because after talking to many kids, teachers, and librarians, I began to understand why so many of you asked me to. September 11 shaped the world you were born into. It's only natural that you'd be curious about it. I hope my story gives you a sense of that day, the fear and the courage, the sense of horror and shock. I will admit that in my plans for this story, Uncle Benny did not survive the collapse of Tower 1. I even told my editor, Amanda, Uncle Benny doesn't make it. She was sad to hear that, but we both agreed that this ending would be realistic. I had it in my mind that Uncle Benny had charged up the stairs to Tower 1 with 50 pounds of gear on his back, determined to get to the fire. Lucas waited for him to return to the firehouse, but he never did. But as I wrote the last page of the last chapter of the book with Lucas on the football field, suddenly there was Uncle Benny standing with his crutches and his shamrock tattoo peeping out of his cast. I swear to you that he just appeared. I could picture him so clearly, still banged up, but with his eyes sparkling, looking at me as if to say, come on, there was so much sadness that day. Could you please give Lucas's story a happy ending? And so I did.
And that was Lauren Tarshis reading from I Survived the Attacks of September 11th, 2001. How far back in history do you go for your topics?
Well, I've gone back to ancient Roman times to write about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii. And then I fast forward to the American Revolution. I definitely have been wanting to kind of fill in some gaps. Like, I've written quite a few books that take place in the early 1900s. That's a crowded part of my chronology, but not enough of the Middle Ages or in pre-Columbian times. So there are definitely parts of history that I would like to get to, and hopefully I will.
There's going to be a lot less source material in some of those earlier times.
That's very, very true.
Yeah. Because now, have you ever written on a topic where you actually had firsthand accounts from children to refer to?
Yes, I have. What else? Another thing that's happened in the series is that I get a lot of mail from people who are in the midst of or just in the aftermath of natural disasters. So the first time that happened was with the Joplin tornado that happened in 2011 in Missouri. I got many emails from people, that was a very deadly tornado strike. I think nearly 100 people lost their lives. And the city was rebuilt. So I got a lot of emails from parents and kids and teachers, and I ended up making contact with the 6 children's librarians, their elementary school librarians, asking, do you think that I should, people are asking, I wasn't sure what to do. And they said, you should come and want to tell their story. So I did go, visited all the schools, really made these great friendships with these amazing librarians who toured me around. And I ended up going there twice. And kids really wanted to, many kids wanted to share their stories. Of course, not everyone does, but I've learned that some people telling the story is somehow empowering, I think, highlighting the parts of the story that are, where they felt that they had helped someone or that someone had helped them. And the same thing happened with my California wildfire book. I wrote that book because of a family named the Fishers. Holly Fisher is a nurse. Her husband, Josh, is a firefighter. And they wrote to me 3 days after the camp wildfire destroyed their town of Paradise. Their son Lucas read my books and said, write to that lady.
Oh.
So again, I wasn't sure I would write about it, but I did go, visited the schools, in their temporary schools, and the kids really wanted, they really were like, you got to write about us. You've got to write about us. So I didn't literally write about Paradise, but their stories really inspired me, and I did go to Paradise twice. And all of the main characters in that book are named after the Fisher family and other families who shared their stories with me. Joplin, I've named characters after all the librarians.
So you had a book about surviving a wildfire?
Yeah, the last I Survived before Galveston is called I Survived the California Wildfires 2018. Oh, it's actually yeah, it was, I didn't, write, I made up a fictional town, but it was, inspired by that terrible fire season of 2018.
And why did you choose to do that, to make up a fictional town instead of write about the real one?
Well, I felt that, number one, it's one thing to write about a large city, but there were a few reasons for it. The first, the Paradise is in the midst of rebuilding itself. So I feel that the story's not, the story is not complete. Unlike Joplin, where they had rebuilt, and I was there after it was rebuilt, and that was such a big part of what people wanted to share with me, right? The resilience of the town. So I felt as though we could look back. There was enough time. There was a retrospective feeling, and that story, it's like, this happened, this is how people responded, and here's where they are today. Things are still unfolding in the West, and obviously ever since. So it just felt more comfortable for me not to presume and overlay my hopes or predictions onto an actual town.
I wonder if you had talked to any of the Holocaust survivors when you were writing about that.
Well, I have a very unfortunate personal connection to that event because I'm Jewish. My husband's family, many of them were murdered by the Nazis, and my mother-in-law, who really was one of my very closest friends, she lived with us for 10 years before she passed away in 2018 at the age of 97. She had incredible experience in escaping Germany. She lost many of her family members, and she and her immediate family spent 10 years in a Jewish ghetto in Shanghai, China. That's where they fled to. So I grew up very, I've obviously being Jewish, I know many Holocaust survivors, and I grew up really kind of steeped in those stories. And it's another event kind of like 9/11, where the more you read about it, the more incomprehensible it is, like how people could plot to do this. Yeah. Same as 9/11, right? The more you read about it, the more evil and, unbelievable it is that this could have happened. And that's not true of most historical events that I've written about. Even something like Pearl Harbor, it was a human-made event, but you can sort of understand it within the context of geopolitics, right? It was a naval base, and all of the, it's not to justify it, but you can understand it, right?
Right.
It had precedent, okay, this is war, and this is whatever, but some events just defy any sort of, you can't put them into any context where they are anything other than barbaric, evil, and still unimaginable.
It's amazing to me how many news stories about World War II and the Holocaust are still out there to be written about. Like you were talking about, that you focused on the story of the Jewish resistance that's been undertold. We've had a number of different books on Writers' Voices in the past few years with really interesting stories based on true stories during that time. For example, people hiding in the sewers in, I can't remember which country that was, one of the Eastern European countries, or women who were dropped behind the lines in Paris to be radio operators. Yeah. There is such a overwhelming feeling of how could this evil happen, but then there's so many stories of courage and good too.
Yeah. Well, I do think that that's in the end what I really try to focus on in my, the theme of my series really is resilience, unity, people pulling together. I try not to model an unrealistic vision of what resilience means. I think that people do, they can overcome incredible hardship and loss, but it often takes time to heal. people need to know to ask for help and not be ashamed if they feel scared or uncertain in the midst of these events. But I am amazed, to your point, that people do somehow, find unreal reserves of courage and hope and tenacity. That is just awe-inspiring.
Yeah, we had one recently about this young woman who hid I can't remember how many Jewish people she hid in her attic. And she, was just an ordinary girl, really.
Yep.
Yeah, it is quite inspiring. Now, I'm wondering, Lauren, do you ever want to write about something other than disasters?
Well, I have my first picture book coming out, which I've actually been working on, a little hobby of mine, because I have a friend who's an artist, a wonderful artist, who has sort of a Maurice Sendak style, wonderful. And she and I decided to try to learn how to write a picture book. So we spent about a year. It was inspired by my dog, who knows all the family's secrets. And it's a story about unconditional love and self-acceptance and those who love us even though we're not perfect. And it's called Only My Dog Knows I Pick My Nose. So it's different than I Survive. It's really not, as my friend Lisa always says, it's not a nose-picking book, and it's not really even a doggy book. It's really about our perfect selves that we like to show the world. And then the selves, if you're a child who doesn't eat their broccoli and doesn't really brush their teeth and makes a mess in the bathtub and doesn't share, and then gets scared and still checks for monsters under the bed. But even that part of us is still lovable.
Oh.
Yeah.
And are there more children's books to follow?
Well, yeah, this one comes out. This is the first. It comes out in October, and Lisa and I are working on a couple other ideas. I always feel it's like sort of a guilty pleasure because I'm supposed to be always working on my I Survive book. But it's like so much more fun to think about dogs and things like that. But yeah, I mean, these books are really and I oversee the magazine division at Scholastic now, the editorial part of it. And so I'm busy, but all the work is sort of connected, as I said, by this, the idea of helping kids understand their world, giving teachers resources that enable them to have really good conversations, and helping kids understand history and learning facts. And so I really do enjoy it a lot, and particularly, being able to talk about it with people like you.
And what age group is the I Survive series written for?
I think I have a lot of very young readers, and I don't recommend it for kids under maybe 8, certainly, and certain kids, but I think it's, grades, 3rd grade is a great entry point for those books. And I even on the Scholastic website, I've sort of given a little list of the ways how to start the series, because certain books, of course, like the Titanic, some of the books are just, much less complex than something like 9/11 or the Holocaust, obviously. But I also have a lot of older readers, which makes me very happy. A lot of middle school kids who aren't avid readers. And now the graphic novels is a whole other audience that does include some older kids who just love comics.
Yeah. I wondered if that was, also the graphic novels might be easier for younger readers too.
Yeah. Yes, in some ways it's interesting because like the Nazi invasion book, which was the 3rd graphic novel, in some ways it's more intense than surprisingly, because it's just, you'll see, it's because there's not as much context. It's just this sort of, it's very intense. So we have a sticker on that book that really, I strongly discourage anyone, I think that book should be carefully vetted by parents, especially for a child who's doesn't know about the Holocaust yet.
Right.
It look, it's beautiful, and it does have a sort of somber look to it. So I don't think it's not going to attract like a little kid who's looking for a picture book. But it's funny how the different the artist styles really do, and each one has a different tone. I just love Corey Egbert. He's the illustrator of the 9/11 book, and I just think that just has such an accessible, clean style. And I think it's really, I just love the way that he, captured my characters.
Yeah, he really did.
Thank you. I'll tell him.
Yeah, I think it must be really rewarding, like you said, to see your books turned into these graphic novels. Maybe, has there ever been any talk about making a TV series of them or anything like that?
We've had a lot of conversations with different people. We've gotten pretty far in certain we're very, very close to signing it. But here's the challenge with it. First of all, it's a very hard series to make because it would be very expensive. It's not like a series where you can build one set and, just,
right.
Well, there you go. So each one, so there's that obstacle. The other thing is that in the end, I decided not to move forward with this wonderful company because I was afraid of losing control over all of the books. You have to sign away everything, future and now.
Wow. Well, I can understand the hesitation, and you're right. It would be challenging, but could be interesting too. Maybe somebody will come up with a concept that works.
I will see, maybe, but I have to say, it's one of those things that's best. I've realized, it would be so exciting, and I'd love to boast about it. When I think, guess what? But I've kind of let go of it in a good way because, it's what the graphic novels have really been that kind of experience, and the fact that they treat them so lovingly is. Makes me even realize even more how important that is.
Well, maybe doing it as an animated series makes more
that's
sense.
Another idea too.
Yeah.
Monica, I'm so sorry.
We're out of time. Yeah.
Yes, but I could just talk forever, but my husband just came in and was like, "What are you doing?" I have to
okay.
hop on to
we are out of time, so thank you so much for being with us.
Great,
Lauren.
And Caroline, wonderful to talk to you as well. And it just, I really appreciate your time and your wonderful questions, and what a delightful thing you're doing. Well,
thank you, and we'll let you go. And then, Caroline, do you have our closing quote?
Well, it isn't a quote exactly, but I just want to compliment this author on to children's point of view, because so many times in life we go through things and we don't realize that our children are going through them too. And we think that they're in their own world, and that they won't notice these things, but they do. And I think that's just great that you're pointing these things out. I really do.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, and see you all next week on Writers' Voices.
Bye-bye.